Warning disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life legends and supernatural folklore. While the narrative includes the name of Conway Twitty, a beloved and iconic figure in American music, the ghostly encounters, paranormal events, and characters described in the story are entirely fictional and dramatized for entertainment purposes only. This story does not claim to reflect actual events in Conway Twitty's life, nor does it seek to defame or disrespect him, his family, or his legacy in any way. Listener and reader discretion is advised, especially for those sensitive to themes of the supernatural. Conway Twitty was known for his deep voice and heartfelt ballads, but few knew the darkness that followed him off stage. Long before he became a household name, Conway had inherited a parcel of land in rural Mississippi, an overgrown patch of piney woods and rotting cabins, gifted to him through his mother's bloodline. It wasn't something he bragged about. In fact, he rarely mentioned it. But close friends recall how, in quiet moments, he'd go silent when someone brought up the old place. That silence was heavy, like he was hearing something the rest of them couldn't. The land had been in his family for generations, passed down from a line of farmers and midwives. It was the kind of place where stories got buried with the dead, and neighbors kept their distance. Old folks in the area whispered that it was cursed, something about the black trees and a woman who walks at dawn. Conway was never one for superstition, or so he told himself. But even as a boy, he'd felt watched. After the death of his grandmother, he inherited the land officially. For years, it lay untouched. Wild vines choked the fences. Coyotes roamed freely. Then, in the mid-1970s, at the height of his fame, Conway made a decision that would change everything. He built a small recording retreat on that very land. A place to get away from the pressure of the road. A place to reconnect with his roots. Construction crews didn't like working there. One contractor quit mid-project after claiming to see a woman staring at him from the tree line. Another said his tools kept vanishing overnight. Conway dismissed it all as nonsense. Stress. Heat stroke. The usual. The final product was beautiful, rustic but modern, with dark wood floors and high ceilings, and a fully outfitted studio in the basement. It should have been a sanctuary. But from the very first night, Conway sensed something was wrong. He woke to the sound of footsteps upstairs, even though he was alone. Windows opened on their own. A dog he brought with him, a loyal German shepherd named Duke, refused to enter the studio, growling and whining at the basement door. Then there were the dreams. They started subtly. Just flickers at first. A shadow in the corner. A song he'd never heard playing faintly in the distance. But night after night, the dreams grew more intense. In one, he saw a group of people standing in a circle deep in the woods, chanting words in a language he couldn't understand. In another, he was sinking into the earth, the soil cold and wet around him, as something laughed in the darkness above. But he kept coming back. There was something addictive about the place, something that pulled at him. He told his producer it was the isolation that helped him write, that he needed the silence to create. But deep down, Conway was beginning to suspect that the silence wasn't silence at all. It was something waiting. One morning, after a night of strange dreams, he wandered out behind the cabin and found an old stone buried beneath the moss. It was roughly carved, with faint markings that had worn down over time. A cross. Some initials. And something else, something he didn't recognize. He knelt down to brush it clean and felt a sudden jolt run through him, like static. For a moment, the wind died completely, and the woods fell utterly silent. He stood, disoriented. The birds weren't singing. The insects weren't chirping. Even the trees seemed to lean closer, listening. That night, he didn't sleep at all. From that point forward, Conway's retreat was no longer a getaway. It was the beginning of something darker. A slow unraveling. A haunting not just of a place, but of a man. After discovering the strange carved stone in the woods, Conway Twitty's time on the property began to feel heavier. The air in the recording cabin shifted, literally and metaphorically. It wasn't something he could explain to his band or his producer, but something was off. The cabin no longer felt like a creative haven. It felt like it had begun to breathe slowly, deeply, watching him from the shadows. The first time he heard it, it was just after 2 a.m. He'd been working on a new melody, something slow and haunting, unlike his usual style. He wasn't even sure where it had come from. The notes had just appeared in his head as if whispered by someone else. He pressed stop on the reel-to-reel recorder and leaned back to light a cigarette when he heard it, a soft whispering sound, almost like someone sighing right behind him. He turned quickly. Nothing. He stood up and walked toward the back hallway of the cabin, which led to a small kitchenette and bathroom. Still nothing. But the sound returned, low, unintelligible whispering. This time, it was coming through the headphones sitting on the desk. He picked them up. Silence. Thinking it must be a feedback issue or maybe a signal from a nearby ham radio operator, Conway made a mental note to check the wiring. But the next night, it happened again. And this time, it wasn't whispering. It was singing. Very faint, just barely audible, an eerie female voice humming a melody he didn't recognize. The tone was chilling. Beautiful, but lifeless. Like someone humming in mourning. He immediately stopped the tape and rewound it. Nothing. Just his own voice, nothing out of the ordinary. He didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't want to look crazy. But his sessions became increasingly uncomfortable. He'd record during the day and leave well before midnight. Still, even during daylight hours, strange things occurred. Tracks would erase themselves. His guitar strings snapped without warning. And once, the upright piano in the corner played 2 slow notes on its own while he was across the room. Trying to keep his nerves steady, Conway blamed it on faulty equipment. Maybe it's just old wiring, he told himself. Humidity messing with the instruments. But deep down, he knew better. Music had always been his soul's language. He knew how notes behaved. He knew how instruments responded. This wasn't mechanical. It was intelligent. Then came the night his longtime producer, Reggie, decided to visit. Reggie had been with Conway for years and had seen him through some of his darkest and most inspired moments. They were close. Trusted each other. So when Conway casually mentioned hearing strange things in the studio, Reggie just laughed and said, "You've been out here too long, man. This is what isolation does to creative people." Still, Reggie agreed to stay the night and work on a few demos with him. The first few hours went fine. Nothing strange happened. In fact, the music was flowing better than it had in days. But just after midnight, everything changed. They were listening to playback when Reggie froze, his hand hovering over the mixing board. "You hear that?" he asked. Conway nodded slowly. There it was again, the humming. The same female voice, clearer now. More distinct. They looked at the tape. It wasn't moving. The recording had stopped. The sound was not coming from the tape. It was coming from the walls. Reggie stood up. "What the hell is that?" The humming turned into what sounded like weeping, followed by a low growl that seemed to rise from under the floorboards. The studio lights dimmed. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the windows even though the night outside was calm. Without warning, the microphones began picking up what sounded like a distorted human voice, speaking backward. Conway's skin crawled. Reggie yanked the power cord from the wall. Everything went dark. The 2 men sat in silence for what felt like hours. Reggie finally broke it. "You need to leave this place, Conway. This ain't right. This place, it's sick." But Conway didn't leave. Not yet. Something inside him still wanted to understand what was happening. A part of him, maybe the same part that made him such a powerful storyteller, was drawn to the mystery. To the melody that wasn't his, but that played inside his head day and night. He began recording it. The ghost song. Piece by piece. Each night, it revealed a little more of itself. The voice grew louder. The air grew colder. The shadows stretched longer. He didn't know it yet, but the studio had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a place for music. It was a doorway. Conway Twitty had always considered himself a man grounded in reason. He believed in music, in hard work, in the power of a story well told. But after the humming, the backwards voices, and the oppressive darkness that now clung to his studio, logic became harder to hold on to. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of that retreat. His peaceful getaway had soured, and now it felt like it was watching him, studying him. The air itself felt denser, like it carried weight. Like it could press against your chest and make you forget how to breathe. After Reggie's panicked departure, Conway found himself spending more and more time alone. His bandmates stopped visiting. His manager began rescheduling sessions in Nashville. But Conway couldn't leave. He told himself he had to finish the song, the one that kept forming inside his head, revealing itself little by little, like a memory he never lived but somehow remembered. He was obsessed. And obsession breeds vulnerability. The first time he saw her was just after a hot shower, one of the only moments of peace he'd had in weeks. The cabin had an old, foggy mirror in the bathroom, chipped at the edges, slightly warped in the middle. He was toweling off his face, humming that cursed melody again, when he caught something in the mirror behind him. A woman. She stood far back in the hallway, pale, tall, her long hair wet and clinging to her face. She wore an old black dress, and her eyes, they weren't eyes at all. They were hollow, like the sockets had been carved out and filled with shadows. He froze. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to confront her. But when he finally did, heart pounding in his ears, there was nothing. Just the hallway, silent and still. He tried to shake it off. Stress, he muttered. Just lack of sleep. But in his gut, he knew better. From that day on, the mirror became a portal. Not every time, but often enough that Conway began dreading walking past it. Sometimes he'd catch a flicker, her face barely there, just behind his shoulder. Other times, her full form would be visible for a split second, like a frame spliced into reality. Always still. Always silent. He covered the mirror once with a towel. The next morning, the towel was shredded on the floor, and the mirror was smeared with something thick and dark, like old engine oil. No signs of forced entry. No animal tracks. Just that foul-smelling smear and a single handprint on the glass. Small. Feminine. But twisted. The fingers too long. The palm too narrow. Things escalated quickly after that. Conway began waking up at night to see her reflection in windows, in puddles outside after rain, in the glossy finish of his guitar. Never directly in front of him, always in the reflection. And always watching. One evening, he sat on the edge of his bed, guitar in hand, tuning it slowly as dusk crept in. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears. He looked into the mirror across the room. She was there again, but this time, she was closer. Much closer. Standing just behind his left shoulder. And she was smiling. Her teeth were jagged. Rotten. Her smile stretched too far, like skin tearing at the edges. Conway jumped to his feet and spun around. No one. Nothing. The room was empty. But his shoulder, his left shoulder, began to burn. He yanked up his shirt sleeve and saw 4 deep, fresh scratches trailing down his arm. Blood had already begun to bead. He rushed into the bathroom to wash it, panic rising in his chest. But when he looked in the mirror again, he didn't see himself. He saw her face. Right where his should have been. He screamed and punched the glass. It shattered instantly, slicing his knuckles. The cabin seemed to shake with the impact. Lights flickered. Doors slammed. It took everything in him not to run out into the woods and never return. But something made him stay. Maybe fear. Maybe madness. Maybe the whisper that now followed him from room to room, calling his name in a voice that sounded like it had once been beautiful, before it drowned. He boarded up the mirrors after that. Every last one. Covered anything reflective. He started writing by candlelight instead of electric bulbs, which flickered constantly now. But reflections didn't need glass anymore. He saw her in puddles of spilled water, in the shine of his silver microphone, in the glint of his guitar strings. She was part of the house now. Part of the music. Part of him. And he hadn't even written the final verse yet. Sleep had become dangerous for Conway Twitty. What once was a refuge after long hours of performing or writing had now turned into a battleground, each night a descent into darkness, each dream more vivid, more violent. He no longer slept deeply. Most nights, he drifted into short bursts of uneasy slumber, only to wake covered in sweat and gripped by dread. But the worst of it wasn't the nightmares themselves, it was how real they had become. How they had started to follow him into waking life. It began with a dream so grotesque and visceral that he remembered every second of it. He was standing in the woods behind his cabin, barefoot and dressed in the same clothes he'd worn to bed. It was night, and the moon was full, but the trees cast shadows that moved in impossible ways. The silence in the dream was total. Not a single chirp, rustle, or breath of wind. He felt watched. Then he heard the singing again. That same mournful humming he had recorded but could never find on tape. But this time, it wasn't coming from the cabin or the trees. It was coming from beneath the earth. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Cracks opened around him like veins in dry clay. And from those cracks rose hands, decaying, skeletal hands, dozens of them, clawing at the surface, reaching for him. He tried to run, but his legs refused to move. The hands gripped his ankles, pulling him down into the soil. He screamed, thrashed, fought, but more hands emerged, clutching at his arms, his chest, his face. Dirt filled his mouth. Darkness swallowed him. And just before everything faded to black, he heard a voice, sharp, cold, female. "You sang after midnight." Conway jolted awake with a ragged gasp, heart racing. The sheets were soaked with sweat. But what made him freeze in place was the burning sensation on his chest. He tore off his shirt and rushed to the bathroom mirror, before remembering he'd covered it with black cloth. He didn't care. He yanked the cloth down and stared in horror. There were deep red scratches across his chest. 3 jagged lines, fresh and bleeding. As if something or someone had clawed him while he slept. He stumbled back in disbelief. This wasn't sleepwalking. These weren't self-inflicted. The marks were angled from the top right to the lower left, no way he could have made them himself. He cleaned and bandaged the wounds, his hands shaking uncontrollably the entire time. Over the next few nights, the dreams intensified. Every time he fell asleep, he was dragged back into the forest. Sometimes he'd hear his own songs warped and slowed, playing through rusted speakers nailed to trees. Other times, he'd be chased by shadow figures that moved like smoke and hissed his name through broken mouths. One night, he saw his grandmother standing at the edge of the woods in the dream. She looked younger, but her face was solemn sad. She held a small object in her hand. It looked like a wooden cross carved crudely from twigs, bound together with twine. "You shouldn't have come back here," she said. "I didn't know," Conway replied, tears forming in his dream self's eyes. "You were warned. You just didn't want to listen." Before he could respond, the ground beneath them split open again, and she was swallowed by a tide of darkness. He reached for her, but his hand passed through smoke. He woke up screaming. By now, the scratches and bruises on his body had become too numerous to hide. When he returned to Nashville for a brief press event, people noticed. Makeup helped. Sunglasses hid the dark circles. But the change in him was clear. He was thinner, quieter, less alive. His bandmates asked if he was sick. He just smiled and said he was working through a new sound. In truth, he was barely holding on. Every time he closed his eyes, the spirit, whatever it was, attacked. And every time he woke, it left its mark. The doctor he finally saw blamed it on stress and possible sleepwalking, even after seeing the wounds. But Conway knew better. The spirit wasn't confined to dreams anymore. It had found a way through. His sleep was now a doorway. And every night he passed through it, he came back with more than just memories. He came back bleeding. Conway Twitty had finally reached a point where he knew the truth could no longer be avoided. The music wasn't just haunted, the land was cursed. The attacks, the voices, the spirit in the mirror, the dreams that left him bloodied, they all pointed to something ancient and rooted in the very soil of his family's property. And it was no longer content with whispers and shadows. It wanted something more. It wanted him. One rainy morning, unable to rest, Conway found himself pacing the upstairs attic of the cabin. He hadn't been up there in years. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and old wood. Sunlight struggled through the single dirty window. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe answers, maybe proof that he wasn't losing his mind. He sifted through old boxes of family belongings, rusted farm tools, sepia-toned photos, brittle books eaten at the edges by time. Then, buried beneath a pile of rotting quilts, he found something that made his breath catch in his throat. A leather-bound journal, cracked and discolored, with his grandmother's initials MET etched faintly into the cover. He sat down on an old trunk and opened it carefully. The first few pages were innocent enough. Notes about harvest seasons, recipes, a few hymns copied in careful handwriting. But then the entries changed. The handwriting grew more frantic. The tone more urgent. His grandmother, it seemed, had seen things too. One entry read, "It started after the third full moon. The soil wouldn't take the seed. The air grew thick with whispers. I woke up with bruises I couldn't explain. And I dreamed of them, those who walk between the trees." Another passage, "Mama warned me never to sing at night. Said it calls them. She said there's something in our blood that attracts the dead." I thought she was just old and scared. Now I know better. Conway flipped through the pages, heart pounding. There were symbols he didn't recognize, drawn in charcoal, looking like strange combinations of crosses and circles. Some were smudged, like they had been traced with wet fingers. Other pages were torn out completely. One entry, dated 1936, chilled him to the core. "There's a woman in the mirror. She watches me every night. First I thought it was grief playing tricks. But I see her even when I'm not alone. She told me if I ever sang after midnight, she'd take something from me. I didn't believe her. I do now." Another line jumped out at him. "The land must not be disturbed. It is buried deep. The cross keeps it sealed. Do not move the stone." Conway's stomach turned. The stone. The one he'd found weeks ago and brushed clean. Had he done exactly what the journal warned against? As he read deeper, he realized his grandmother hadn't just documented these events. She had fought back. She had performed rituals, built charms, poured salt at doorways, chanted psalms backward. But in her final entry, dated just days before her passing, her words became desperate. "They're stronger now. The music calls them. I can't keep the veil closed. They want the voice. They want the one who sings. The one who sings." Conway dropped the journal, his hands trembling. The warnings hadn't just been for her, they had been for him. Passed down through generations, hidden in scribbled pages, ignored out of pride or disbelief. He sat there in stunned silence, the rain tapping against the attic window like skeletal fingers. The pieces were coming together. The spirit he had seen, the dreams, the scratches, it was the same entity that haunted his grandmother. And now it had turned its attention to him. Conway took the journal downstairs and placed it beside his bed like a Bible. That night he didn't sleep. He lit every candle he had, salted the windows, and placed the cross his grandmother had once kept near the door. But deep in the walls, he still heard the humming. Stronger now. Closer. And as he sat in the silence, clutching the journal like a lifeline, he realized something horrifying. The song he had been writing, the one that came to him bit by bit, night after night, it was in the journal too. Scrawled in the margins. The same notes. The same words. Conway hadn't been writing it. He had been remembering it. Or worse, he had been given it. The cabin had grown colder over the last few nights, unnaturally so, despite the August heat outside. The fire in the hearth would burn brightly, yet the chill persisted. The shadows clung to the corners of the room a little too long. The creaks in the floorboards didn't match the rhythm of his steps. Something was building like a storm just beyond the tree line, biding its time. Conway Twitty knew he was close to the center of it. The journal had made that clear. His blood, his voice, the act of singing, it all tied into something much older than music. A curse. A calling. And though he tried to resist it, the melody still came to him in fragments. He'd find himself humming it absent-mindedly, writing down verses he didn't recall thinking up. It was as if the song was using him as a vessel. And each note opened the door a little wider. Then came the night that changed everything. It started just like the others, a dark, still evening with no wind and no stars. The pine trees outside stood unnaturally stiff, their needles not even rustling. Inside, Conway had locked every door, salted every windowsill, and kept the journal and his grandmother's wooden cross close by. He hadn't planned on playing. In fact, he was done with music. He had told himself that repeatedly. But around midnight, something shifted. A pressure built inside his chest, like his lungs were being squeezed. The air in the room grew thick, almost unbreathable. Then he heard it, his old reel-to-reel recorder whirring to life on its own. The tape began spinning, even though it wasn't plugged in. A voice came through the speakers. Not humming this time. Singing. It was his own voice, slow, warped, echoing like it had been recorded underwater. He was singing the song. The one from the journal. The one that never existed until now. He stood frozen as his voice on the tape repeated the final verse over and over again. Sing it after midnight, bring the dead to rise. Trade your soul for silence, but never close your eyes. The lights flickered. The candles blew out all at once. The room fell into pitch black, and the humming returned, louder than ever. Not just one voice now, but many. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Then came the banging. From the basement. The sound of fists slamming into the walls, into the floorboards. It came in waves, like something massive trying to break through. And with every impact, the house trembled. His guitar, hanging on the wall, flung itself to the floor with a harsh, metallic twang. Conway grabbed the cross and backed away from the stairs just as the basement door creaked open on its own. From the darkness below, two pale hands gripped the doorframe. Then she emerged. The woman from the mirror. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her decaying frame. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face. And her eyes, two black hollows, seemed to stretch beyond the physical, into something ancient and endless. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, shadowy figures began to crawl out of the stairwell, twisted, then things that once may have been human but now moved like puppets with broken strings. They hissed in unison, their voices overlapping, and one word echoed from their throats: sing. Conway's mouth opened against his will. The melody filled his mind. His fingers twitched. His throat vibrated. He was being forced, his voice hijacked. The first notes slipped from his lips, soft and trembling, and the moment they did, the entity surged forward. He stumbled back toward the fireplace, clutching the cross. And oh, he screamed, trying to resist the urge to sing. But the music poured out of him. A duet with the dead. His body betrayed him. In a moment of desperation, he remembered his grandmother's journal, the passage about the fire. When the veil breaks, only flame can close it. He grabbed the oil lamp beside the hearth and threw it to the floor, shattering it. Flames erupted instantly, dancing across the wooden floor and licking the walls. The spirits shrieked. The woman's smile cracked unnaturally wide as firelight burned through her form. The walls groaned. The shadows twisted violently, clawing at him, before evaporating into smoke. One by one, they vanished, screaming, retreating, dissolving into the darkness. Conway collapsed, gasping, as the cabin burned around him. But he was alive. Bleeding, shaken, haunted, but alive. He crawled out the front door into the dirt, coughing under the weight of ash. As the flames consumed the house behind him, he heard one last sound, a single, clear voice, drifting on the wind. You sang after midnight, but you never finished the song. Conway Twitty didn't speak for 3 days after the fire. He was found by a local farmer at the edge of the woods, shirt torn, eyes bloodshot, lips cracked and burned. The farmhouse he had built, his retreat, his sanctuary, his recording cabin, was now nothing more than a blackened skeleton of wood and ash. Fire investigators chalked it up to faulty wiring. But Conway knew better. He refused the hospital, refused the press, refused to sing. His manager, alarmed by Conway's silence and the bruises scattered across his body, reached out to someone unusual, Reverend Thomas McNair, a paranormal investigator and faith-based exorcist who had once been featured in a late-night documentary on hauntings in the Deep South. Conway would never have called someone like that himself. He wasn't the ghost hunter type. But he also wasn't the same man anymore. The fire may have driven the spirits out for now, but the song still lingered in his head like a disease. He agreed to meet Reverend McNair at a quiet motel on the outskirts of town. The man arrived in a black suit, carrying nothing but a Bible, a cassette recorder, and a satchel full of hand-carved crosses, vials of oil, and salt. His eyes were sharp and calm, the kind of calm that comes only after seeing too much. They sat in silence for several minutes before Conway finally broke. "I didn't invite it in," he whispered. "You didn't have to," McNair replied. "Sometimes the door is already open. Sometimes it runs in the blood." Conway shared everything: the dreams, the mirror, the attacks, the journal, the melody that came in pieces like a curse building itself. McNair listened without interruption, scribbling notes in a small leather notebook. When Conway finished, the Reverend asked only one question: "Did you finish the song?" Conway shook his head. "Good," McNair said, standing up. "That means we still have time." They drove together the next morning to the ruins of the cabin. Smoke still clung faintly to the trees. Black ash dusted the grass. But McNair wasn't interested in what had burned. He was interested in what had survived. The stone Conway had uncovered weeks ago, the one his grandmother's journal warned never to disturb, remained untouched. They stood in front of it, both men silent. The stone radiated a deep, bone-chilling cold. McNair circled it, muttering prayers in a tongue Conway couldn't understand. He poured salt around the base, then traced a symbol in the dirt, a countersigil to the one Conway had seen scrawled in the journal. "This is a tether," McNair explained. "A binding site. Old Appalachian magic mixed with something much older. You sang the song, and it cracked the seal. Not all the way, but enough to let things through." Conway stared at the stone, feeling a strange pull in his gut. McNair then produced a small tape recorder, the same kind Conway used in his studio. "I want you to sing the song," he said. "But only the parts you've heard. We need to trap it. Give it something to follow. Then we seal the tape." Conway hesitated. "What if it finishes itself?" "Then you stop. You fight it." The first few notes came out hesitant, shaky. But the melody was still there, waiting just behind his teeth. He sang the first verse, his voice low, almost mournful. As he sang, the wind picked up. Leaves spiraled in the air. The trees creaked as if warning him. Then his voice changed. It deepened, twisted, like something had taken hold. The lyrics shifted into a tongue he didn't recognize, and his eyes rolled back slightly. McNair moved fast, pouring holy oil onto the tape recorder, chanting louder than the wind. The moment Conway began the final verse, the Reverend slammed the tape shut and smashed the recorder to the ground. There was a flash of heat, followed by silence. No wind. No birds. Just stillness. Conway gasped, collapsing to his knees. McNair knelt beside him. "You were singing in a language that hasn't been spoken in over 1,000 years, he said. "Whatever was attached to that melody, it nearly consumed you. But it's bound again for now." That night, Conway stayed at a local inn. He didn't sleep, but he didn't dream either. For the first time in months, the humming was gone. No footsteps. No voices. But the scars remained both on his skin and in his soul. Before McNair left town, he left Conway with one final warning. If you ever hear the song again, don't finish it. Burn the tape. Bury the notes. And never sing after midnight. The months that followed were quiet, almost suspiciously so. Conway Twitty returned to his Nashville home, surrounded himself with family and familiar comforts, and slowly tried to return to some version of normal. He didn't sing for a while, not even in the shower. His studio remained locked. The piano sat untouched. But the silence felt like a necessary wound, one that needed time to scab over before it could be tested again. The press offered wild theories for his sudden retreat from music, burnout, health issues, secret projects, but Conway didn't care. He wasn't trying to protect his image anymore. He was trying to protect everyone else. But a curse, once awakened, rarely slips back into the ground without leaving its mark. One evening, about 6 months after the cabin fire and the ritual with Reverend McNair, Conway was going through an old box of demos in his garage. He was looking for something simple, a forgotten melody, maybe a rhythm he could use to start fresh. Buried under reels of tape and aging lyric sheets was a cassette with no label. His heart dropped when he saw the cracked corner of the case, scorched black like it had been in a fire. It was the tape. The one McNair had smashed. It should have been destroyed. He watched it break. Watched it burn. Hands trembling, Conway grabbed a towel, wrapped it around the cassette, and threw it into a metal trash bin outside. He doused it in lighter fluid and set it ablaze. The plastic bubbled, curled, turned to ash. But as the fire died, Conway could swear he heard the faintest hum coming not from the flames, but from inside his house. The melody. Faint, dragging like a whisper under the floorboards. He froze. This time, there was no mirror. No flickering light. No black figure watching him from the doorway. Just the melody. And it wasn't coming from a radio or a tape recorder. It was coming from inside him. He pressed his hands to his ears, shut his eyes tight, tried to will it away. But it was there in his chest, in his pulse, threaded into his breath. The melody was a part of him now. Whatever he'd opened months ago had never really left. It had simply gone quiet, watching, waiting. He contacted Reverend McNair again, desperate for guidance. The Reverend's response was short. "I feared this might happen. You were the vessel. The song chose you. It can be silenced, but it can't be destroyed, not while you live." McNair offered one grim solution: leave music forever. Never perform. Never sing again. Mute the vessel and the melody would have no voice to escape through. It was a sacrifice Conway wasn't sure he could make. Music had been his life, his salvation, his identity. But now it was also his curse. For the next few years, he walked a careful line. He performed occasionally old songs, safe ones. Nothing new. Nothing untested. If ever a melody started to form in his head that felt too easy, too smooth, he would hum a hymn or leave the room entirely. Sometimes, he'd wake up with lyrics written on the inside of his forearm in faded ink. He never read them. Just scrubbed until the skin went red. He kept his grandmother's journal locked in a box, wrapped in cloth, stored in the attic. He never opened it again. But he knew the truth. The curse wasn't in the house, or the cabin, or the stone. It was in the song. And the song was in him. Shortly before his death in 1993, Conway Twitty gave a final interview to a close friend. It was never published. But in it, he said something that haunted those who later heard the tape. "People think the devil comes with horns and pitchforks. But I think he comes with rhythm. With beauty. With a song you can't stop humming, even when you don't know the words." After his passing, family members were instructed not to release any unreleased demos. One box, in particular, was sealed with strict instructions: do not play. Do not copy. Do not sell. It's still locked away somewhere in a private collection. But late at night, some fans claim, if you turn on an old AM radio just right, you can hear the faint hum of a melody that never made it to vinyl. And it's beautiful. Too beautiful to forget. Too beautiful not to finish. Even if it kills you. 93.